This is... What? This is boring.
So, as I'm sure everyone is aware, Shazam! Fury of the Gods just came out. This movie was very heavily marketed, and everybody knows that it exists. I wouldn't be surprised if it became the highest grossing movie of all time, given how many people are lining up to go see it. Alright, in all seriousness, Shazam 2 is just so average. I think it might actually be the most normal movie I have ever seen. And while that might not sound like a bad thing, the truth is that this movie is just unremarkable. I don't believe in the idea that a movie or even just any work of art has to be saying something deep and thought-provoking, but when something is just so basic and uninteresting, it just becomes forgettable. I think the best way to describe this movie is that it kind of feels like a Disney Channel original. They're never gonna blow your mind, but they aren't really that terrible either. I think the perfect way to explain the lack of narrative going on in this movie is the fact that my dad, the person who got me into superhero movies and comics, the one who was collecting all of the superhero DVDs before I was, and yes, I said all of them, the same guy who enjoyed Fan4Stick enough to buy it on Blu-ray, went to the bathroom during the middle of one of the action scenes in this movie. Not just any old scene of exposition or bad dialogue, an action scene. And I think that the worst part about this movie is that it's not even that bad. It's just so plain. And I know it sounds like I'm being pretty harsh here, but I think I'm more frustrated with how average this movie is than I would be if it was just straight up bad. Not because I expected it to be good, but because I figured that there would be at least one thing in this movie that I like. But no, everything is just so generic. The plot is interesting enough, but it gets weighed down by poor writing and boring characters. The villains in this movie are just so generic. They have little to no motivation, act stiff and lifeless for most of the movie, and just feel so boring. And we're talking about characters that are played by fucking Helen Mirren and Lucy Liu, both of which have several wins and nominations for awards, including Oscars. And I've seen a lot of people praise this movie for the relationship between Freddie and Anne, but I'm sorry, I just can't take this shit seriously when the writing is straight out of a fucking CW show. And the rest of the characters are just uninteresting and for the most part, useless. The jokes aren't funny, the writing is corny and hard to listen to, the pacing is god-awful, the action is dull and filled with mediocre CGI, and the movie just lacks charm. Also, a small side note, but this movie features one of the worst and most annoying product placements I have ever seen in anything. The advertisement is so prominent that it actually plays a role in the fucking movie. And I really do hate complaining about all these things, because the truth is, this movie isn't that bad. It's just so goddamn annoying to see a movie that had such little substance. And it's clear to me now that WB knew this, because it had barely any advertising, no buzz or hype, and cheap reveals to bring in audiences that wouldn't see it otherwise. Which, by the way, is probably one of the worst cameos I have ever seen in a superhero movie. Remember in the last movie when Superman showed up for like a second, but they didn't show his face because Cavill wasn't in the suit? Well, that same thing happens in this movie, but for a whole fucking scene. And that's not even the worst part, because in one of the weirdest choices in DC history, this scene features a strangely prominent form of blackface, and while I am kind of joking about that, it was just a really odd choice. I don't really know what to say at this point, and I really hate this phrase, but I think the best way to describe this movie is mid. Most of the time, people use that term to describe decent movies or shows that have somewhat divided opinions, but I think it is much more appropriate to use it to describe movies like this. Movies with so much going on that the good stuff and the bad stuff just cancel each other out. Something with so little substance that it just ends up forgotten. And I'm sorry guys, I know I really ragged on this movie hard, but in reality, it's not really good or bad, it's just mid. In these types of videos, especially on movies like this, it's so much easier for me to talk about the things that didn't work for me, but that doesn't make it bad, it's just easier to explain that kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and give Shazam 2, The Fate of the Furious, a 5 out of 10.